Hello and welcome to this screencast on 15 mark questions in component 2. This is for OCR A-level psychology. We're looking specifically at section B evaluation skills today, and we're going to concentrate on reductionism as our ATMID. Okay, so without any further ado, let's have a look at this. Okay, so I've got a question here, you can see. It asks you to assess the usefulness of reductionist research in psychology and use examples of core studies. So the first thing that we need to do when we get a question like this is to consider the demands of the question. What is it actually asking us to do? So what I've done here is I've split this into two different parts. Okay, we can ignore this for the moment. We know it's in component 2, and obviously we're going to be using core studies as our examples. But let's have a look at the two parts of this. The first bit here asks us to assess. Now you'll know if you've watched any of the other videos, assess is just one of those other key terms that is associated with evaluation. So if we're talking about discussion, critically evaluate strengths and weaknesses, etc. Assess is just the same sort of idea. It's asking us to say, you know, whether reductionism is a good thing or a bad thing, and specifically with regards to how useful it is in this particular situation. Coming on to that then, this bit here, the usefulness of reductionist research, is the context that we need to be working in. So all of the answer needs to be referring to either how useful or less useful a piece of reductionist research is generally within psychology. Okay, so that is that's our question. Assess the usefulness of reductionist research in psychology. Use examples of core studies, and we have considered the demands of the question. The very first step. Now, what do we do? Okay, we're still considering the demands of the question. The question requires you to link ATMID to the issue of useful reductionist research or not useful or less useful reductionist research. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do is to think about what makes a piece of research reductionist. Okay, then you need to decide whether that makes it useful or not by linking ATMIDs to it. Okay, so the first thing to do is, when is a piece of research reductionist? What makes it reductionist? So consider, if you will, the definition of reductionism. Yeah. Now, if you remember, reductionism is the idea of looking at a single level, usually, of explanation. You know, going down to the very bones of something. So simple cause and effect relationships. So if you're looking at a reductionist explanation, you're looking at simplifying it down to its very core. Okay, boiling it right down. What causes the behaviour in the most simple way that we possibly can. Think about it. And a reductionist piece of research, if you remember, is one where we're simply looking at one factor or a single level of explanation, if you will, which is then going to go on to form some sort of explanation about the behaviour. Okay. And remember, when we are evaluating, we are linking ATMIDs. Okay, that's really important that we use ATMIDs to evaluate what it is we're talking about. Whopefully, this will become a little bit more clearer once we break this down a little bit further. Okay, so still considering the demands of the question. The first question, the first part of that was, what makes reductionist research useful? Okay. Well, the first thing to understand is that reductionist research helps to simplify complex behaviour to make it understandable. So if you've got very, very complex behaviour, well, you can look at it from all different areas if you want to, but if you want to kind of understand it in any way, you're going to need to simplify that down. You're going to need to make it less complex. By doing so, you're going to make it more understandable. If you imagine how a car works, well, if you imagine all the different parts that are associated with that, then that's going to be very difficult. But if you know how particular components work on that car, then eventually you can start putting it all together to actually come up with a holistic explanation. But you need to reduce it down to start off with. So it makes complex behaviour more simple, makes it more understandable. Allows researchers to isolate variables. Now, if you remember, isolating variables is a key part of scientific research. Okay, so you can hopefully you start to shout out psychology as science at that point. Yeah. And allows cause and effect relationships to be produced. Now, that's really useful. If you've got cause and effect relationships, that means that you've got a far bigger possibility of getting some practical applications from that. Yeah, can you see how that would make a piece of research useful? reductionist research in this particular case. Okay, what else? What makes it kind of less useful? So what are the kind of the problems with reductionist research? Well, just in the same way that it breaks down complex behaviour, reductionist research can be accused of oversimplifying the behaviour. And if you oversimplify something, then you fail to explain it properly. If you fail to explain something properly, then your explanations lack validity. They're not accurate. They don't cover the full picture. It may fail to account for the effect of the environment, society, or individual differences. That's something you can kind of tag on to the top one if you want to. Just give some explanations that you could maybe use. I don't know, social learning theory could come into that, couldn't it, perhaps? It may produce, now this is a bit of a, I would say, an advanced one, but by all means have a look at this and have a think about this one. It may produce deterministic explanations for behaviour that may be socially sensitive, as they could lead to the marginalisation of vulnerable groups. So you think about it, if you have a piece of research which is reductionist, okay, you get a cause and effect relationship. That cause and effect relationship becomes predictable. Okay, predictable research is deterministic, isn't it? That's kind of one of the definitions of what we mean by determinism. It has a clear causality. However, if that research is then used to marginalize groups in society, vulnerable groups, then we could talk about that research as being socially sensitive. Now, can you see how that's quite complex what we've done here? It's kind of the opposite to a reductionist explanation in many ways. That's a holistic one. We're using lots of different things to sort of broaden this argument out here. Anyway, like I say, a fairly advanced one for the moment, but do consider that one. Okay, moving on then. Right, so now consider examples of reductionist core studies. We know what makes research useful or not if it's reductionist. Okay, what core studies might we use? I've just picked out a few. I mean, as you can imagine, psychology is full of reductionist research, but ones that are going to be fairly easy to use. Now, if I just pop a few of these up. Loftus and Palmer, fantastic to use. Why is it reductionist research? Well, think about it. We're just looking at the effect of leading questions, aren't we? Just one level of explanation. Grant et al., again from the cognitive area, just looking at one level of explanation, the effect of context on recall. Milgram. Now, why is Milgram a reductionist piece of research? If you think about it, what is the explanation he puts forward? A situational explanation. A situational explanation is by its very, very nature a reductionist explanation, because it's only looking at one particular level of explanation. Same with Bocchiaro, again, situational, therefore it's reductionist. Cheney's very, very reductionist. Again, go back, have a look at your notes. I'll not go through all of these, otherwise I'll run out of time on this. Casey, again, biological reductionism. Baron Cohen, again, is reductionist. I could have come up with just about every one of them there, to be honest, but those are the main ones that I would suggest will be dead useful to use. Right, let me show you an example then. So remember, we're going to do a Peck paragraph. Okay, on this one, if you've got if it's a 15-mark question, I would suggest you're probably looking at 4 Peck paragraphs altogether. 2 which are for useful, 2 of which are for less useful. So here you go. The point here I've done, reductionist psychological research can be considered useful as it often uses highly controlled laboratory experiments. Now, you see I'm using that method there to link with usefulness, which seek to establish cause and effect relationships by measuring the effect of directly manipulating the independent variable. So there you go. There's a little bit of a definition of laboratory experiments. Now, what am I going to do with that then? There's the point I'm making. I'm saying it can be useful, because it uses laboratory experiments. I'm using Grant. Okay, so for example, Grant's study into context-dependent memory was reductionist. So I'm kind of making sure that belt and braces here, that's linking back to reductionism, as it sought to establish the role of one factor in improving memory by conducting a controlled laboratory experiment. You can see we've got those 2 in there, and then I've explained why that is. You can read through that yourself, okay? Okay, and this I always think is probably the most important part that students do tend to struggle on this the most. Okay, this is when you bring it all together. Okay, this is the strength of reductionist research. Okay, I suppose I could. Oh, I've got useful there. As using a laboratory experiment supports the psychology of science debate. Okay, and is useful as it helps to develop clear cause and effect relationships between concepts of learning and recall, which could be used to develop advice for students sitting exams and may be of benefit to police officers helping witnesses recall the events of a crime. Okay, I've said why this particular piece of research is useful here, haven't I? Talked about it being reductionist, talk about it linking to psychology of science, talking about the lab experiments there. Hopefully you can see if you put that PEC together, you should have a nice paragraph there which talks about why it is that psychological research is useful. And we've used an example, like I say, of particularly reductionist research. So all you would need to do then, I say all you would need to do, you've got to do a little bit more on this, haven't you? You've got one paragraph done there. Can you do 3 more? Okay, can you do another strength? Okay, so go back to the slide that talked about the strengths. So pick out one of those, or maybe one of your own that you've got yourself. Okay, let's have a look at 2 weaknesses as well. Okay, so things which make reductionist research less useful. Okay, but you need to practice those PECs because they are hard work when you start off with, but hopefully you'll find them a lot easier. Go back, go through this as many times as you want to, see what you think about it. You can maybe do a better job than I have, I don't know, but anyway, have a go at it. Hope that's useful to you anyway.